Hello and welcome back to The Healthy Practice from Right Up. I'm your host Ellie and I'm delighted to have you here with us once again. In today's episode, we're approaching a topic some of you may find yourself avoiding: the importance of getting therapy as a therapist. Now, to dive deep into this somewhat uncomfortable topic, I was joined by the wonderful Patricia Barber. Patricia is an HCPC registered counselling psychologist and a chartered member of the Psychological Society of Ireland. She offers psychological therapy to both adults and children in Galway and online, and she is also Director of Psychology at My Psychology Ireland. Patricia also hosts the fabulous Thinking About Therapy podcast. Now, we had a really great chat about why having your own therapy can make you a better therapist and how therapy protects you from the occupational hazards of being a therapist. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. So welcome to The Healthy Practice, Patricia. It is so fantastic to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's lovely to be here.
Oh, it's great. So this topic is quite a personal one, and I thought it'd be interesting to start with what drew you to working in the therapy space to begin with.
Yeah, so I have been very lucky that I'm somebody that's always known that I wanted to do psychology as a career. And I was very lucky that I had from even secondary school level, I had a psychology teacher that allowed me to do my A-levels there and get a glimpse of psychology. But the actual therapeutic part of it, when I was maybe 10 or 11 years old, I had a very severe phobia of dogs, to the point that I wouldn't maybe go for a walk at all, or my parents were quite concerned if I had seen a dog coming that I would run in front of a car just to get away from it. And so at that age, I'd had a really positive experience of cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT, and they used what we call like graded exposure to help me overcome that really severe phobia. And it was a really positive experience that I'm very grateful that I had. So that, alongside then the fact that I was interested in psychology, really just helped me in terms of a career path and what I wanted to do, and that's how I've ended up as a counselling psychologist.
Oh, that's amazing. And how's your phobia now? Did you manage to overcome that fear?
Absolutely, yeah. So I was maybe 10 or 11 at the time that it had happened, and then at 13 or 14, I think, my parents actually had bought me a dog as well after that, to help with it. But I would be absolutely fine now. I have no problems going for walks or anything like that. I maybe would be a little bit hesitant of bigger dogs, but not as in I'll let them walk past me, I can let them come up to me, all of those kind of things. But a very excited dog would still cause me to feel anxious, I suppose, internally, but wouldn't cause me to, whereas before I wouldn't have went to somebody's house if they had a dog. If I'd have said, okay, well, let's go for a walk, and then we got out of the car and I heard a dog barking, and it could be somewhere really far in the distance, I would pick up on it right away, and I just wouldn't go.
Yeah, it really affected your life, but you've moved past that now. That's really good. That's amazing. And that's a really early positive experience that you had.
Yes, and it was very lucky that I had such a positive experience.
Yeah, really lucky. So that really triggered it in your mind to seek that and to do that as your career. So in this episode, we really wanted to explore the importance of therapists getting their own therapy and looking at some of the reasons why they might not choose to do this. Yeah. And off the bat, is having your own therapist seen as a taboo still? Is there still a stigma surrounding therapy, even for therapists themselves?
Yeah, I would love to say that there isn't, and I do think that it is changing, but I still think, speaking to my own colleagues and stuff like that, that there is a stigma around it. And I think it's maybe even sometimes our own stigma. We feel like we're the ones that are supposed to have it all together, if there's such a thing, and therefore the idea of going to see somebody can be difficult. Or sometimes even our families might say, oh, is it not unusual for you to have to go see somebody whenever you're the one that's, helping other people? And even sometimes when we attend other medical professionals, unfortunately, you still receive some of that stigma of where you might ask for support in terms of therapeutic, like counselling or something like that, and they later find out that you're in that work in that area as well, and there's sort of a sense of like, oh, so how come you're here, as if you don't need it. But
as if you've got all the answers yourself.
Exactly.
And you should be able to like cure or heal yourself. Yeah.
And the biggest thing I say to anybody who has that stigma, or whenever I've talked about it with my own colleagues, is a reminder that we're just people too. We have all of the same emotions and experiences as other people, and we go through the similar things in life in terms of like grief and bereavement, or relationships changing, or work stress. If people have children, if they have had difficult experiences in their upbringing, all of those things, so it makes us, we're not immune to those things just because we do this job. So it's really,
Oh, absolutely.
like really, really important. And I think that I do believe that the stigma is changing, that it's much more acceptable, and it's actually been seen as a really positive thing to firstly talk about the fact that you've been to therapy, and second of all to say as a professional, actually, I really benefit from going.
Now I'm doing so now I've just actually finished my level 2 in counselling
Yeah, yeah.
course, and I'm going on to level 3.
Great.
And in my level 3, they say that they advise that you have 10 sessions of your own therapy, but and then they say because in level 4 you have to have 10 sessions. And is that across the board, or is that just at particular places that you train? Does everybody have to have therapy when they train to be a therapist?
No, not necessarily. No, it is dependent on where you do your training and who the course is provided by, and whether or not they set that
Yeah.
as a requirement. Some courses don't have it at all. Other courses have it as a recommendation, and then other courses will have it as an essential part in order for you to complete the course. So you might, for example, have to take the form from the course to the therapist and sign off that you have attended a certain number of sessions with them. So it's not standardized. I suppose I really think it should be, because it's a fantastic way of learning about therapy. And I think it's interesting where if there's a kind of a bit of a debate about should it be mandatory that you have to go, or should it not. And it's interesting that therapists themselves feel so strongly that why should I have to go and do that. So it relates to me to that stigma that we just talked about, that they feel like, well, I shouldn't have to do that. But for me, it's such a huge learning experience to be the client. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe if they made it standardized, it might help with that stigma a little
Absolutely.
bit. Maybe people are
Yeah.
thinking, oh, well, I went in my training, it was great, it really helped me. Maybe I could go back to that like later on now that I'm working. Maybe that would help with the stigma.
Exactly, and it would just be a very essential part of it, in the same way as we all have supervision, and that's very normal, and it's not, there's no stigma around it. We all need supervision. I think the personal therapy element would be helpful. It's one of the things that generally differentiates, I suppose, the counselling psychology training from the clinical psychology training, is that
Yeah.
most, if not all, of the counselling psychology doctorate programs require personal therapy as part of it. But I think it's as the years go on, it's been rolled out across nearly all the courses, because we're seeing the benefit of it.
And you mentioned supervision there. So what's the, obviously there is a difference, but what sets supervision apart from having your own therapy? What's the big difference there?
Yeah, so there can be a huge amount of overlap between the two, but the biggest difference is that really your supervision is mostly for your work with the client, or what's happening with the client. Your personal therapy is really what's going on for you, or what's happening in completely your life, not work related at all. So in supervision, we tend to bring cases that we have and discuss, how we're getting along with that person. Do we notice anything in terms of our relationship with the client? Are they somebody that we feel like we have just completely different values, and how might that be affecting our relationship? But also, are we doing the right work with them? Do we have a good understanding of what they're coming with, and are we able to support them well, or what might be the challenges around that? Or if there are issues around risk or managing the case. But the personal therapy is very much about like me, what's going on in my life, and very often there can be a little bit of blurring occasionally if something work related. You're taking it home with you, is the way that I would put it. Whenever you take it home with you, that's when it might go into the personal therapy space. But it's much more about like what's going on for me in terms of my life, whereas supervision is much more about the client.
Yeah. And what are the benefits of seeing a therapist as a therapist? Do you have any examples of how it's helped you when you've done it?
Yeah, so I've had multiple different therapists across my training. It was a requirement of my own training, so I had a different therapist, and actually I changed therapist each year of my training, and now I continue to have therapy on and off as and when I feel like I need it. And one of the things that I do is actually regularly, not regularly but now as much, but I do change who I go and see. And for me, I've learned so much from being reminded of what it's like to be the client, because I think when you're working in a therapeutic space, you can very quickly lose sight of what it's like to come and meet somebody for the first time. So I learned a huge amount in terms of how important it is for clients to know where they're coming, because sometimes I might go and see a therapist and I have, just a random, I don't have full directions. And so now I'm already anxious before I've even gone in. I've learned lots about, for me in my work, about the space, what the space must feel like in order for it to be comfortable for people. I've had therapy in a range of different places, from like really lovely therapeutic spaces to in the corner of a community hall with an electric powered radiator beside me, thinking I don't really feel like this. If the environment doesn't feel safe, then it's not going to feel safe for me to emotionally talk about how I feel. So there's a huge amount of learning from me, and mostly, thankfully, I've had positive experiences. But there's just little things that I've taken from it that have really helped.
Yeah, that's really good. And it sounds like it's really helped you as a therapist as well as you personally. So
Absolutely.
It's like built your practice by being the client.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
Yeah. And that's why I kind of change every so often, because if I get, it's not to say, and I often talk about it with the therapist as well. I say, like, if I get too comfortable here, then I never experience that first session again. And the first session for people is often the most difficult. And so I like to be reminded of what it's like to sit there with somebody who you haven't met before and who you don't know what you're going to have to talk about. And also it helps me with clients in the first session when they come to see me. I'm able to say to somebody who's really anxious, actually, I do know what this feels like, because I know what it's like to come in and not know what we're going to talk about today. So for my work, especially because I do a lot of work with children and young people, so right now my experiences have allowed me to prepare a lot of material to make them more comfortable to come in, because I've learned over time that a child or a young person is going to feel better attending if they can see what I look like before they come in, if they can hear a video and hear my voice. I send them pictures of the room and the space. They also get pictures of our receptionist so that they can really get a sense of where they come in before they even come in. And all of that I've learned from me going to my own therapy, because as I said, I think I might have very quickly overlooked it otherwise.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it really puts you into the client's frame of mind, doesn't it? And it helps you to do that, as apart from instead of being that sort of separate entity. And you mentioned you have changed therapists lots of times. So how do you find your therapist, and how can therapists find a therapist to work with?
Yeah, I think as time goes on, it's becoming one of the most difficult things for me to do, is find a therapist. There's lots of things that make it difficult. We tend not to maybe want to go and see somebody that also works in a similar area geographically, or in a similar area in terms of work that we do, because we might be sharing referrals at some stage, or maybe we might go to a training and they might also be there. So we tend to try and look out with our kind of local area for somebody to go to. But I think that's maybe one of the more positive things that has come out of COVID, is our openness to doing online therapy a lot more. And so now my therapists tend to be, I'm based in Ireland, they tend to be in the UK, and we tend to have less chances of crossing kind of paths. But the other thing that I always say is, even though, like, it's okay to be two therapists working in the same area who are supporting each other, but generally there's a conversation in your therapy about what will happen if we do meet each other at a professional development event or something like that, like, so that we're both clear on what the boundaries around that look like. But it can be really difficult. So sometimes I might ask my peers, can they recommend anybody? Or I might have heard from a client, for example, about another very good therapist. So that would be how I would kind of seek out that support for myself. And it's not easy. It's not easy for clients, and then when we become the client, it's not easy for us either, with the complication of also being a therapist.
Yeah, I bet. Do you find it hard to take off your therapist hat and be there fully as a client when you're having therapy?
I would say that there are definitely times where I find it difficult to do that. I think that whether we want to or not, we can't help what we know. And so if you're sitting in therapy with somebody and it's the first session and they haven't talked about confidentiality, I'm already thinking about that. But it's very easy for me to put that to the one side then. And I suppose a very good therapist will allow me to be the client in therapy. But I've come up against challenges where perhaps maybe I've been talking about something, or if I was distressed in any way in the therapy, and the therapist has responded to say, like, well, you know what you're supposed to do now because you're a therapist. And instantly it puts you back into that role of being a therapist, whereas actually you would really like them to just assume you don't know anything and treat you like the client. So there can be real challenges in that sense of staying as the therapist. Interestingly, one of the things I noticed in my more recent therapy is that the therapist doesn't have a clock in the room. So I don't know what time it is. during my sessions. And in my own sessions, I spend a lot of time monitoring the kind of the clock and seeing where we're at to make sure that a client doesn't share something just before the session is about to end, for example, or if I feel like there's something important for us to address, I might be making sure, do we have enough time to do that? So I kind of spend enough time glancing at the clock. And in my own therapy, there's no clock. And initially I found that really difficult. And I had a conversation then where I said, there's no clock here. I don't know if I've got time to talk about things or not. And my therapist said, actually, will you let me be the therapist? And I won't let you do that. And I thought that was really lovely.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's what you do with your clients. Yeah. But you're just so used to looking at the clock. Do you disclose that you are a therapist when you have therapy, or have you ever not disclosed it, or is that just something that you happily do, or how does that make you feel?
I've always disclosed it, but I have contemplated at times not disclosing it to see would it make the therapy different. I suppose there's that worry then about the deception, like later on, and how it would affect a therapeutic relationship. But maybe there again, that's me thinking as a therapist automatically. I would love to at some stage experience that where that somebody doesn't know that I am a therapist. I have, however, gone into other medical professionals and not explained it, because I have experienced that sort of automatic assumption that I will know what it is that they're talking about. But in terms of my own actual therapy, I've always shared that I am a therapist. Initially, I was a therapist in training while I was there, so I had to share that because I was asking them, are you open to signing the form at the end after we've had so many sessions? But I can really see how it would be helpful to not share it. But I imagine it would be very difficult because so much of what you would bring to the personal therapy would relate to your work. And I don't know how you would get out of answering,
I know. I was thinking about that yesterday because I was like, would I disclose it or not? Because obviously I'm training, so I will have to, as you say. But further down the line, I was thinking, would I or not? And I was really interested. So thank you for answering that, because I think you're right. I think if I didn't disclose, I'd feel almost guilty, that deception. So yeah, it is. It's one of those things you kind of feel, well, you kind of have to, but it would be interesting to see if you didn't, if your experience of therapy would be different. Maybe you could do that one day and let me know.
I know I've often contemplated it when I've kind of started therapy again, thinking, could I just get away with a first session where I don't say it and then say it after that? But what I will say is the more positive experiences of my own personal therapy that I've had have been with a therapist who I'm able to tell them what I do and have a real clear conversation about, I really want to be the client here. I don't want to be the therapist. And them to almost kind of, and I equally, I suppose I've been on the flip side of that. I have been a therapist providing therapy to other therapists. And it's something I would work very hard then to do, is to say, like, let's put that to the one side. Let's not make the assumptions that they know things. I'll ask them, are you familiar with this, or do you want me to explain it? All of those kind of things. So, but yes, definitely in the future, it's something, I think I go back and forth on it. I really want to, and then I think, is it deception or not? I don't know. But
yeah, it's hard. That's a really hard one to call, isn't it? It's a really difficult one. And what are the biggest lessons that you've learned as the client in therapy that now help you in your practice? You kind of touched on the room and things like that, but are there any other lessons that you've learned as the client?
I think lots of things, thinking about there's maybe times where I have had maybe a difficult session in my own personal therapy and then maybe had to go to work afterwards or do something. So it's taught me to talk about that with my clients, to say, if you're coming into a session, what do you have afterwards? Do you have time and space in the day to take care of yourself from everything that you've, experienced? I think a lot of things around those first appointments, how do we help somebody, feel more comfortable to attend? And also another thing would be, how do we review how the therapy is going with time? So I've had some therapists who I've maybe felt like we've come towards the end of the work, but it's been very difficult to have that conversation. And so in my own therapy, one of the things we do is kind of periodic reviews after every 6 or 8 appointments, and it's just a quick conversation around, are you happy enough to keep continuing? Do you feel like you want to continue coming to appointments? But it really opens up the conversation for somebody who might want to say, actually, I feel like I want to take a break right now, rather than just them cancelling an appointment and not coming back. So there's, I mean, I could talk all day about the various different things, you know, that I've learned. Even then, just thinking about, as I said, we're not immune to. I've been to therapy for things like anxiety, and you know, sometimes learning from other people's approach of how they do things. You know, thinking like that was a really positive way to explain something, or a really positive exercise that they set me to do in between times. So, and then using that with your own therapist, you know, it's such in-person experiential learning being a client.
Yeah, I suppose you get to see, because you've seen quite a few different therapists as well, you get to sort of pick and choose ideas that they have, or like techniques that they've used, and then you can integrate that into your own practice. I think that's a really nice idea.
Absolutely, yeah. And even experiencing, so we talked there a lot about like the first appointments and the start. How your therapy ends is also really interesting, and really important. And ideally we always work for a good kind of therapeutic ending where both people agree on it, and it is an agreed ending. But there have been times where maybe I, you know, have maybe had not such a great experience of therapy, and I've thought, actually don't even think I can tell that person that. Or I've come to the end of therapy with somebody and they haven't asked me how have I found it. So I don't have the opportunity to say, actually I find these things really helpful, but these things were more difficult, or this is why I don't feel like I want to come back. So not having had those. So that's for me, where in my practice then that becomes really important. Or another thing is I say it to all my clients from the outset, I will ask you in the future if you feel like we relate well and we get along well and you want to continue to see me, because it is as much about, you know, our values and how we relate to people. And just as we make friends with different people when we meet them in everyday life, the same is true for therapy. We're not always going to find a therapist that we just relate well with, and I don't want to be a barrier for anybody accessing that. So I'll say that to them at the start, and then I'll say, if you keep coming back at about 6 or 7 appointments in, I'm going to ask you, do you feel like we have a good therapeutic relationship enough for you to continue? And I don't take offence if somebody says no, and it hasn't happened very often, thankfully. There's been a couple of instances where it's maybe been, I would like to see somebody who's older, or actually I think I would prefer to see a male therapist. And for me, I think that's fantastic that I have a client sitting in front of me that's able to express that. That's exactly what I want. And then I facilitate them, you know, seeing somebody else. But I would say a lot of what I would call kind of the process related things, or the interpersonal things in therapy, are things that I have learnt as a therapist in therapy, not from reading or, you know, or textbooks, or learning about models and different approaches.
That's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
And quite a good takeaway for people if they're thinking, you know, if they're thinking of getting therapy, or are not quite sure, you know, it's not only going to help you personally, but it actually might help you build your practice or strengthen. Or
I've never had a situation where I have had a client sit in front of me for personal therapy who has had nothing to talk about, and we've sat in silence for an hour. And I really believe that therapists, I'm a huge believer that everybody would benefit from like 4 to 6 sessions of personal therapy throughout the year. In my experience, you will always have something to talk about, and you will always feel valued by somebody just listening to what's going on for you. And so that for me is as a therapist, you'll benefit from that in the same way as everybody else will benefit from it. But then we get the added benefit of also looking at, oh, how did that person do that, or what did I find helpful? So that's
yeah, it's like a dual benefit. Yeah. And we say, and as therapists, we're always saying, you know, everybody will benefit from therapy. So why not the therapists as well? You know, everybody's going to benefit. And yeah, you got that double edge of getting some ideas for your own practice. So that's really cool. And do you think, as a community, as in the therapy community, there's anything that we can do to normalize getting therapy as a therapist?
I think conversations like this are great, so that other people hopefully listen and realise it is completely normal to do so. I think the biggest thing is to talk about it and to share and to completely normalise it. So I normalise it with my own clients, but I think it's interesting, just as I was preparing for today, to think about, I suppose, I would openly have the conversation with clients, but if I was in a room full of psychologists, would I openly have the same conversation about attending therapy? I think I would, but I don't think, you know, I am not sure that all of my peers, you know, would, that there can be that stigma around, if I attend therapy, do my colleagues think that there is something wrong, and therefore that I'm not able to do my work effectively? That's often what it comes down to. And I think the biggest change there has to be realising that in order for you to do your work effectively, therapy needs to become part of that and normalised. I think it's fantastic that the various different courses at different levels are starting to include it as a real fundamental part of our training, and that will massively help normalise it. And I think that as we maybe then go through different training routes, as long as it's continued to be normalised by everybody along that's going to be helpful. And I think then it's down to conversations with our peers where they're maybe talking to us about different stress, and that we're able to say, well, have you thought about going to speak to somebody? And that's where for me it shifts back from, if I'm sitting with one of my colleagues who's also my friend and they're talking about something stressful, that I'm able to shift into seeing them as a person and as a client and saying, well, would you not think you would talk to somebody about that? That's kind of what I think.
Yeah, that's really good. And I'm just thinking about when you're training as well. So I know from my experience of training, you're learning so much about yourself just through the training anyway. Yeah. And that can bring up a lot. And it's brought Absolutely. Up a lot for me. And I think seeing somebody to talk about that would be the most normal thing for you to do, because it does, the counselling training does change you. It changes the way you think. It changes the way you approach things. And it does bring up a lot. So it should, I don't know why it's not standard across the board that everybody should have therapy, just to help you through that training, because it's such a massive upheaval of emotions and everything. So I'll be interested to see if that does become a standard thing, because it would definitely help normalize it, I think.
I used to describe our training as what I would call like I feel like I was reset. I was kind of taken into training, and everything that I was thought was analysed and reflected on, and how my relationships and how I reacted or related to other people was reflected on. And then I was learning so much information at the same time. And when you're learning so much about different types of anxiety or mood disorders, and particularly for us, we would have went through a period where each week would have been a different kind of mental health related disorder. And I remember coming out each week and we all had nearly diagnosed ourselves with whatever it was that was happening. We were thinking, I can see myself in a little bit of that OCD. I can see myself a little bit in that personality stuff. And it was lovely to be able to go to a therapist and say, actually, this is what went on for me in the midst of all my training this week. And especially if you're training where you're seeing clients as well, your focus is often on learning so much about a client presentation. Maybe you're doing an assignment where you're doing a case study on a client. It's all client related. The personal therapy is a space for you to go in and say, I'm really overwhelmed with the amount of work that I have to do. This came up this week in our training. We were talking about dealing with grief and bereavement, and actually what it brought up for me was an experience that I had where I lost somebody when I was younger or whatever it is. So it's such an important thing to have that space for you. And I suppose a lot of people maybe feel like they are well supported and have family members around them or good friends that they can talk to those kind of things about, and maybe they do, and that's fantastic. But there will be some people who feel, actually, I don't have that support or somebody who has that level of understanding, and that's where the personal therapy then is meant to support you.
Yeah, absolutely. Because and if you feel alone and you can't talk to anybody about that, and that overwhelm just builds and builds and builds, and it's not healthy. So I think it's it's a no-brainer really for me to get therapy as a therapist. So there may be people that don't want to seek out like traditional client therapist relationships for themselves. But so what other things do you think that they could be doing for their own well-being as a therapist?
I think if they're not already, then good supervision is also important. I speak with a lot of people who maybe have supervision but don't necessarily feel like it's great supervision, and I would be saying, okay, well, I think it's important that you feel like you're really benefiting from it, and that you've got a good relationship with your supervisor, so that yes, it is about the client, but every so often there's a bit of a check-in on how you're getting on as well. So supervision is an obvious and most important kind of one. Like for me, supervision can also help me with my like boundaries around the clients that I'm working with, and do I feel like I'm able to take on somebody with the caseload that I currently have. I think the lovely thing now is that there is so much mental health information available. So for some people, they really benefit from listening to podcasts or audiobooks on particular things and relating that in terms of their own life, and building it into their kind of daily or weekly habits in terms of taking some time out and listening to like a mental health podcast. There's also loads of, I know it's still therapy, but it can be modified in different ways. So there are services now that are more like text or email based. That works better for some people. And I think a lot of the reasons that people would have had before for not attending therapy, like I can't fit it into my schedule or I can't find the right person, we've lost all of that now, because you can get therapy at any time now after COVID. So But just it comes back to the really, what I would call the really basic but really boring things too that people don't always like to hear. Things like making sure you're sleeping well, how are you eating, like do you have a good routine, do you feel like you have peer support as well. For me, that's something that's been really helpful as a therapist, that I might have had supervision yesterday and I might not have my personal therapy until next week. But if I have peer support that I can contact over the weekend about something, that's really helpful as well. So there's loads of things right down to, as I said, like the basics, like the sleep, the eating, the routine, having boundaries in place in terms of your work. But then there are the more social elements of making sure that you have like peer support around you as well. And what I would say is there is something to be said for having friends who understand is one thing, but having peers that are working in a therapeutic space is also really important, because they really have another level of understanding. No matter how great our friends and family are in terms of support, to have a peer who can understand is really, really powerful. And there are more and more what we call like reflective spaces opening up for therapists. So where it's not supervision and it's not really personal therapy either, but it's a chance for a group of therapists to come together to talk about whatever might be coming up for them all that week, or just to give them a space to just actually stop in their week and say like, how are we all doing?
Yeah. How do you connect with peers? Because is that how you found yours, through groups, or was it from your training days, or so how did you find all your peers?
So I suppose I'm part of a peer kind of group that includes a number of people that I did my training with, that we've just kept in contact and have found that we maybe, interestingly, sometimes some of us work completely differently, and but that works really well in terms of a peer support, because we're able to think about things differently. We have different strengths in terms of what we think about. There are different groups that are available. For psychologists, for example, there's a Facebook group for UK psychologists, and there's one particularly for those in private practice. That's a very helpful resource, and that's where a lot of groups have been set up in terms of reflective practice. For me, then, it's also been people perhaps that I've met over time through CPD events, or that I've maybe made referrals back and forth to and gotten to know them a little bit better, and then maybe felt the need for, or noticed that I've been checking in with a colleague. So I work privately and maybe they work privately as well, and we're doing a lot of checking in back and forth. And then realising, like, would it be helpful for us to do this in a more structured way?
Yeah.
Or it's sort of, I suppose if you don't ask about it, then you won't find out about them either. But I really believe that they exist. And if they don't, then I say, well, what's stopping you from generating that yourself with the people that you do have around you? I'm trying to think how I've come across most of them. I think it's been through word of mouth from other therapists. There's a couple of them that I've set up myself, because I've thought, okay, I could really do with this, and I really feel like these are a couple of people that we really bounce off well together in terms of thoughts. And so if it's not there, then I'd really encourage people to consider setting it up themselves. And it doesn't always have to be with other therapists. It can also be with other mental health professionals as well.
Oh, that's a really good idea, because I was thinking about that in the future. I'm like, how am I going to meet anybody else? But I suppose it's just finding those groups online or locally, and then and CPD, another great way to meet people. Yeah.
And from what I can tell from seeing it in other groups as well, so at the minute I'm kind of a part of as many groups as I can kind of manage at the minute, but I regularly would see somebody put up something to say, oh, I would really benefit from having a reflective space. I don't work Thursdays. Is there anybody else who would be around to do that? And I don't think I've ever seen a post like that go up on a forum or a group that I'm part of that hasn't had so many replies. So it speaks to how much that space is valued and is wanted. And as I said, it's difficult because there's no one place to go to find it. But if you can kind of establish it yourself, or in my experience, I think because I'm quite open to that, I tend to hear about it from other people, or I've just kind of come across it. And it's just a fantastic resource to have if the sort of more traditional therapy isn't something, that people can attend.
But blending both of them is probably the best thing you can do.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Therapists, are you ready to simplify your practice and focus more on what truly matters, your clients? Well, I'm here to introduce you to Write Up, the all-in-one practice management software designed specifically for busy therapists like you. Imagine having your appointments, clinical notes, and billing all seamlessly integrated. Well, with Write Up, you can schedule sessions, keep secure, detailed records, and streamline your admin all in one place. Spend less time on paperwork and more time making a difference to the people you treat. Whether you're in private practice or part of a larger team, WriteUp is the smart, secure and simple solution you need. Visit writeup.com today and start your free 30-day trial. That's WRITEUPP.com. Before I let you go, Patricia, I just want to know, would you be open to having another therapist as a client of yours? Or have you ever actually given therapy to a therapist?
Yeah. So I've had that on like a number of occasions across my career, and it's a very interesting like dynamic. But I suppose I've benefited from being the therapist who's been in therapy. So that's where it relates again. You know, I'm able to say to them, I know this can feel unusual because I'm a therapist, you're a therapist. But so I'm very open to that. And the biggest thing that I've had is maybe more conversations about that at the start. How would they like this? You know, would they like me to make the assumption that they aren't a therapist? Would they like me to speak to them as somebody who doesn't know, I assume, doesn't know anything, kind of, you know? Some people have said to me, well, look, I can't, you know, naturally you can't help what you know. And then other people have said just treat it like everybody else that comes through the door, you know. So but I'm very open, you know, to that, and I think that there's more and more of that happening, which I also take as a good sign, you know, that the stigma is reducing, that it's not people just coming because they're doing it as part of their training. I think it's interesting that there's more people coming after that and saying like, no, I'm kind of volunteering to be here because I think it's helpful.
Yeah. And yeah, it's something that I think, you know, if you're working as a therapist, you know that therapy is helpful. So I find it strange that there is that stigma. I don't know. I find it so surprising that then as a therapist, you wouldn't be like, well, I'm going to go to therapy because I know how helpful it is. Yeah. So I do find it strange that not everyone's doing it, you know?
It's amazing. I guess I can think of a few occasions where I've maybe had a conversation with somebody about they have that very strong opinion of we shouldn't be made to do that in our training, or I don't believe that, you know, we need to go. And, you know, that's where I put my therapist hat on again. And I think I wonder why you wouldn't want to do that, you know, in this working in this context. But again, it's no different to anybody that we meet who isn't a therapist, who knows in their head that it's a good thing to do, but doesn't want to go. And usually, you know, sometimes that might be anxiety based for them, or, you know, they maybe aren't ready to talk to somebody as well, and that's okay. So, but I think, yes, it's for me, it's blindingly obvious that we should be in therapy, but, and it always has been. So sometimes I find it really hard that other people have, you know, that different of opinion in it. And maybe it would be interesting to speak with somebody who really has that strong opinion about why they shouldn't be, you know, in therapy, to see, is there, you know, what's their reasoning behind it.
Yeah, I'd love to know. I'd love to know that. And it's been really fantastic to have you here. Where can our listeners follow more of your work?
Yeah, so I am quite active on like social media. I'm Dr. Patricia Barber, or my practice here in Ireland is My Psychology Ireland. So on Facebook or Instagram, and then we have our website mypsychologyireland.com as well, which I suppose is growing in terms of things like webinars and stuff like that, or these kind of conversations that we're having. One of the things I'm really passionate about is providing people with evidence-based information and helping them see that it's so, you know, that we should take that stigma out of attending. So I have a podcast series myself called Thinking About Therapy, which is exactly these kind of conversations, really taking the stigma out and normalising, here's why you should attend and here's what happens. Amazing. So that's where I am if anybody wants any more information.
Oh, I'm sure they will. So that's been absolutely fantastic. What a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on today, Patricia.
Thank you very much for having me.
And that's the end of today's episode. I just wanted to say a massive thank you to Patricia. Remember to check out writeup.com for all of your practice's software solutions and to start your free 30-day trial. No payment details are required. Thanks for listening to the Healthy Practice podcast. If you enjoyed it, please do leave us a review. It helps more than you might think. And also subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.